Hello, welcome to our note session on quadratic formula. Our essential question is, how do we use the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations? Let's start out with the quadratic formula itself. Quadratic formula is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. Remember that this formula is used to solve equations with a degree of 2 in the form ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. And I want you to make a special note that the equation must always be equal to 0 before you try to plug into the quadratic formula. Let's go ahead and pause for a moment, and we will start off with our first example. Okay, example number 1. We're going to solve 3x squared minus 16x minus 12 equals 0 using the quadratic formula. And over here I wrote your steps down that we're going to follow. And as I said before, always make sure that the equation is equal to 0 first. So that's our first step here. We're going to make sure that our equation is equal to 0, which it is. So I'm going to start out by writing down that equation. And then step 2 says we are going to label our a, b, and c. A is always the number that's in front of the x squared, b is always the number that's attached to the x, and c is always the number that has no x's. So our a is equal to 3, our b is equal to negative 16, and our c value is negative 12. Always make sure that you include the negative as part of your number if there's a minus in front of it. Alright, step number 3, we're now ready to plug into our formula. The formula says x is equal to the opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. And if you're feeling really special, you can sing that to the tune of Row, Row, Row Your Boat. I'm not going to. Alright, so we're going to plug into the formula. First thing I'm going to do is plug in the opposite of b. So I go up to look at b. b is negative 16. The opposite of that is positive 16. Plus or minus square root, and then it says to take b and square it. So we're going to be squaring a negative 16. Remember, anytime you square a number, you're going to get a positive number as a result. So make sure if you're using a calculator, you put the negative 16 in parentheses before you square it. Minus 4 times a is 3, and then times c is negative 12. And then we're dividing all of that by 2 times a, which is 2 times 3. Now we're moving on to step 4, which says simplify as much as possible. I'm going to do this in multiple steps. So I get 16 plus or minus square root. Negative 16 squared is 256. And then I have a minus 4 times 3 times a negative 12. When I multiply all of those together, I get 144. And it's going to be positive because that was a minus times a negative. That makes a positive. And that's all divided by 2 times 3, which is 6. Okay, moving on in my steps. Just continuing to simplify. 16 plus or minus 256 plus 144 is 400. So we're taking the square root of 400, and then we're going to divide by 6. And as I continue this, square root of 400 is 20. So we have 16 plus or minus 20 all divided by 6. And this is where we're going to take our answers and separate it into two pieces. And the two pieces are going to look like this. The first one, we're going to do 16 plus 20 divided by 6. And the second one, we're going to do 16 minus 20 divided by 6. The plus was the first one, the minus was the second one. That's how we end up with our two answers. Remember, it's a quadratic, so because it's a degree of 2, we're expecting two answers. So the first answer, if I simplify this out, 16 plus 20 is 36 divided by 6 is 6. So my first answer is x equals 6. Second answer, we have 16 minus 20, which is a negative 4. And we're dividing that by 6, and negative 4 divided by 6 becomes negative 2/3. So we have two solutions, x equals 6 and x equals negative 2/3. Go ahead and pause, finish copying this in your notes, and we'll move on to the next example. Okay, example number 2. We're going to solve 2x squared plus 5x plus 1 equals 0. First thing we're going to do is make sure it's equal to 0, and it is, so that part's good. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to label our a, b, and c. So our a value is 2, our b value is 5, our c value is 1. And now we're ready for the third step, which asks us to plug it into the formula. So plugging into x equals the opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. So the opposite of b is negative 5 plus or minus square root 5 squared minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is 1, all divided by 2 times a, which is 2. And now we go through and simplify. We have negative 5 plus or minus 5 squared is 25 minus 4 times 2 times 1, which is 8, all divided by 4. Simplifying a little bit further, we get x equals negative 5 plus or minus square root of 17 divided by 4. And at this point, I can't take the square root of 17, so I'm going to leave that alone. I can simplify, or I can separate it into two parts. Negative 5 plus the square root of 17 divided by 4, and negative 5 minus the square root of 17 divided by 4. So either one of these answers is acceptable altogether or separated. So go ahead and pause, finish copying this in your notes, and we'll do one final example. Alright, welcome back to example number 3. We're going to solve 4x squared plus x equals negative 3. And remember, the first thing we have to do is always make sure that it's equal to 0. So my very first step that I'm going to do is going to be making this equal to 0. So I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So I end up with 4x squared plus x plus 3 is now equal to 0. So we are good to go at this point. A little smiley face there, because that's what we wanted. Step number 2, we're going to label our a, b, and c. So our a value is 4. Our b value is 1. There's a 1 in front of that x. And our c value is 3. Now that we have it labeled, we're ready to plug in. So let's go ahead and plug in. Plugging into the formula, x equals the opposite of b plus or minus square root b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. So if we substitute in, the opposite of b is going to be -1, plus or minus square root 1 squared minus 4 times 3, all divided by 2a, so 2 times 4. Simplifying this, I get x is equal to -1 plus or minus 1 squared, which is 1, minus 4 times 4 times 3 is 48, all divided by 2 times 4, which is 8. So we're almost there. Simplifying this a little bit more, we've got -1 plus or minus square root of 1 minus 48 is a -47 divided by 8. And as I simplify this, I see that I have a -47 under the radical, which you cannot have a -47 under the radical. So you have two options. If the problem just wants to know the real solutions, you would just say no real solutions. Your second option, if it's asking you to find the imaginary solutions or the complex numbers, is you would call this x equals -1 plus or minus square root of 47. And to take care of that negative that's under the radical, I'm going to put an I to represent that it's imaginary, and then divided by 8. So you can either write it as no real solutions, or if it wants the imaginary solutions, you would put the I in the answer to take care of the negative, the square root of a negative number. Go ahead and finish up your notes and have a good evening.